Hey, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Stuart Patrick, Chief Executive here at Glasgow Chamber of Commerce, and welcome to this our regular half-hour session with me on what has been occupying our day. What are we working on? What sorts of issues we're facing? And then to give you an opportunity to ask me questions or give me suggestions of things that we may need to be tackling. I thought today I'll give a bit of an introduction on two issues. One is the day-to-day interaction that we're continuing to have with both UK and Scottish governments on the various support packages that are available to help businesses get through the crisis. Obviously, issues as well around parts of the schemes that aren't helping because there are gaps. And the second thing I thought I would say a little bit about was the extent to which we're beginning to look ahead to what happens when the crisis begins to lift, although of course we don't know yet when that's going to be. But I'll cover both of those and then open it up for some discussion. First of all, on the shorter term issues, we are acutely conscious that cash flow issues are rising for a whole series of members, not just here, but obviously across the UK. Every week, we are contributing to the British Chambers of Commerce Coronavirus Business Impact Tracker, which is looking at the implications for the membership. And we are very aware that almost a fifth of members had said maybe only have about a month's worth of cash to survive in the absence of cash coming in from the various schemes. So there's been a significant amount of pressure being brought to bear on how those schemes are working and the pace at which they're getting into company bank accounts. The one that perhaps has had the biggest take-up, or at least looks as if it's having the biggest take-up, is the job retention scheme. And we know that from the Chancellor's comments yesterday that the scheme will launch formally. In other words, companies can register those that they have furloughed on the 20th. And that the comment is that we should expect to see payments beginning to arise arrive rather in business bank accounts a few days after that. And the Chancellor actually was suggesting it take 2 or 3 days to administer and then maybe 2 or 3 days for a back transfer to occur. So that was the suggestion. That's certainly the steer we've been getting through the British Chambers of Commerce as well. But we are also beginning to put some pressure on the Treasury to make its comments about how long the job retention scheme is going to last. It's currently scheduled to last through to the 31st of May, but we are saying to the Treasury that particularly for larger organisations, the 31st of May is almost, well, it's got to the point now where official notifications of redundancies for larger companies is almost upon us. So they actually need to say something about the extension of the job retention scheme very soon, or large companies might start issuing redundancy notices. But we are equally concerned to discuss with them how the job retention scheme should be playing out over the longer term in the crisis, because we're arguing vigorously against the suggestion that it might simply just stop on a particular day. We would prefer that it was gradually wound down, and that for some sectors that have real doubts about how quickly they can recover, especially ones that are dealing in business to consumer markets where it might take some time for consumer demand to recover, dropping the job retention scheme too quickly could just mean that companies start issuing redundancy notices at the point of its closure when they haven't had enough time to build up demand to allow them to recover. So that kind of discussion is going on through the British Chambers of Commerce with the Treasury right now. We've also been engaging with the Treasury and the Business Secretary over the operation of the CBILS, the Business Interruption Loan Scheme. because you've seen I guess you will have seen all the statistics showing how relatively low the usage is. The Chamber's own business tracker survey suggested that maybe between 1% and 2% of those who'd applied were so far getting successful approvals for the loan scheme, and we have been gradually increasing the pressure on the government to consider whether it needs to keep on loosening some of the constraints on its operation, including asking that they might look at whether they need to raise the level of the guarantee from 80% to higher than that. And equally, we saw the Chancellor a week past reacting to loosen some of the constraints over how banks might give CBILS support. But we know there's still a lot more to do in order to get that on the ground. And I know the banks, I've certainly been having conversations with our colleagues in the banks, and there's no doubt they're trying incredibly hard to get the money into approvals. We've had one success today with the announcement from the Scottish Government from Kate Forbes as the Finance Secretary on the issue about small business grants to various properties affected by the virus, where in Scotland small business grants of 25,000 level had been awarded to companies on a one company basis as opposed to a grant for every property. That has now been lifted. That constraint has been lifted today. So Scottish companies can now, if they qualified for the £25,000 grant, can now apply for every property that is eligible, although the grant is 75% for the second property and beyond, rather than the full 100%. But still, it's closing the gap between the Scottish and the UK position. So that is good news, and we're delighted to see that coming from Scottish Government. And that is unquestionably coming from direct pressure through the likes of Scottish Chambers of Commerce, ourselves directly, and from individual businesses making their representations to politicians. That has been a success. We are still arguing that the rateable value for those grants that sits at 51,000 is still a bit low, particularly if you happen to operate in areas where rateable values are quite high, city centres being the obvious case in point, where 51,000 rateable value isn't really that high a value. So quite a lot of small businesses are being excluded from the support simply because of where they are. We have suggested that they might want to look at rateable values up to 95,000 as the threshold for that 25,000 grant. No word on that yet, but we are still pushing it. We're also still pushing with the Treasury on the small companies which have director owners that are paying, who have been following good tax advice to pay themselves a low salary and the rest of their income through dividends, and who are therefore struggling with the job retention scheme as a means of support, and don't qualify under the self-employment scheme either. So we are still pushing on that as a matter of concern, and we're hoping to get some feedback from the Treasury on that one. We had also been asking for support for certain assets, particularly for the aviation industry. Scottish Government did move on that and awarded rates relief to airports, which we're concerned about that because of the long-term damage. If we're going to rebuild our international trade connections, we absolutely need to have airports in a good condition to be able to respond. So we've been pushing on that as well. So that's a bit of a rush through some of the existing issues that we're tackling on a daily basis that are all designed to try and make sure that cash is getting into businesses to help them survive over the next few weeks and months. We are also, though, turning our attention to the longer term, and we established 2 weeks ago the Chamber's Glasgow Business Resilience Council, which we are drawing on a variety of members' inputs to help us shape some of the suggestions for what we would need to do in order to recover quickly as a city. What is it that we should be recommending to the partners in Glasgow, the City Council, to the national agencies, the academic community and the wider business community, what sort of actions do we take together in order to recover quickly? We know that we can't say when lockdown will be lifted, and we don't know how lockdown will be lifted, but we can imagine some of the issues that will arise for various businesses as they come back into normal business activity. Consumer confidence, consumer behaviours, expectations for how businesses ought to operate could all be very different as we come out of lockdown. And we have now been discussing the extent to which it's possible to pull together some scenarios that explain the different approaches that might, or the different ways in which recovery and lockdown release might happen, and what that could mean for different sectors of the business community. We know that different sectors will be affected in different ways. So the extent to which construction, manufacturing, service industries, particularly consumer-facing, tourism, hospitality, retail, are all likely to face different challenges in coming back to normal business. Whether that's the extent to which lockdown lifting measures might require the use of PPE equipment in order to allow businesses to open. How do you get that PPE equipment? We all know that that's getting tough to secure. The extent to which social distancing requirements will still be in play. How on earth does that affect, or would that affect hospitality industry particularly, retail industry as well? We're seeing different countries lifting the restrictions on a case-by-case basis. Education differently perhaps. Again, construction, some sites opening, some not. So all sorts of issues like that we want to start to understand what the different scenarios could be, and therefore what recommendations we would be wanting to make to government that will help speed up the recovery. But we also want to consider what could we do at a Glasgow level that would help to get the business community running as fast as possible and help recovery to occur to the maximum level. So we started that conversation with, we've got about 60 of our senior business folks who've been engaging with us and giving us some sort of steer. But I'm equally interested in hearing from everybody in the membership on some suggestions and issues that you think we should be thinking about in order to make Glasgow's recovery as quick as possible.